Here is the fourth in the video series on major threats to biodiversity. This one we're going to focus on invasive species. This issue is rapidly becoming my biggest concern. It needs to be discussed internationally the same way climate change is. I would suggest that addressing invasive species as an issue will actually be much harder than addressing climate change. While climate change is a single issue with a relatively straightforward cause, invasive species are hundreds, if not thousands, of little issues that each require a separate solution. So, here is your very general introduction to invasive species. And again, I'll encourage you to check out the additional readings section for this video on My Learning Space. In this video, to address invasive species, we are going to describe the difference between an introduced and invasive species and explain how it happens. We will also go over where invasive species seem to be the biggest problems and explain how invasive species can also be diseases. We of course have to review the most common consequences of invasion and go over how we can deal with it. I'll take a few minutes at the end to explain how our human value system has also made this issue extra complicated. Any species that is moved from one place and introduced to another place is non-native or exotic or alien. When these introduced organisms create a new self-sustaining population that causes economic or ecological harm, we call them invasive species. While species have moved around naturally forever, the ability of humans to move them long distances at a commercial scale has led to a huge number and diversity of organisms being introduced into new ecosystems at an unprecedented rate. Thankfully, only a few species are invasive. Most species are poorly matched to their new environment, and when they arrive are of such small numbers that they suffer from the small population problems similar to the way an endangered species would. Reintroductions, sequential reintroductions of a species will greatly increase the risk that a self-sustaining population will occur. We've seen this with European starlings. When they were introduced to North America, the first 3 times it didn't work. The 4th introduction into New York City's Central Park did, and now there are over 200 million individuals all over North America. This is really unfortunate, just to say, because European starlings are a huge crop pest. They've competitively excluded native cavity nesting species, and they've brought down international jet planes, causing deaths for people. But what starlings demonstrate is what scientists call propagule pressure, which is the frequency and quantity of organisms introduced basically increases the likelihood of them becoming an established self-sustaining population. The higher the propagule pressure, the more likely a species will become established. In 1996, Williamson and Fitter introduced the rule of tens, which describes how rare it is for a species to actually become a serious invasive species that threatens habitats, ecosystem services, or species. The idea is that only 10% of imported species will escape control or cultivation, and only 10% of the escapees will establish a self-sustaining population, and only 10% of those will become invasive. So if you had 1,000 new species brought to Canada, only 1 would eventually become an invasive species. It's probably important to note that we shouldn't take this rule literally. It's just a rule of thumb that indicates the probability risk of a species having an impact. This rule makes it sound like invasive species should hardly ever be an issue. But the reality is that so many new species are being introduced into new ecosystems that they're starting to outnumber the native species. And like Puerto Rico is a good example of this, where 90% of the freshwater fish in Puerto Rico are non-native. It's also been observed that there's often a long time lag between introduction and invasion. A study of woody tree species in Europe found a lag of 147 years. So you got to keep watching. Lastly, the 10% risk of something being invasive is probably too low an estimate because ecosystem harm is often subtle and probably goes largely unnoticed for long periods of time. The root of the problem really is just that we're moving species around. We probably shouldn't do that. So why do we do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, European colonization brought many invasive species. This was often intentionally done for sport, food, or entertainment. So, like trout and bass are a good example of that. Many plant species were transported to be grown as ornamentals or as agricultural species and sometimes as soil stabilizers, which is why kudzu was brought to North America. Many more species have been moved around accidentally, either because their seeds were mixed in with other seeds that were being collected, or as maybe an accidental introduction of a disease because it was in a sick individual that wasn't detected. Can also be because a parasite was hiding in its host and the host was brought. Sometimes these are stowaways. Rats are the classic example of the stowaway invasive species. But like zebra mussels were introduced into North America accidentally through ballast water, and the emerald ash borer was introduced accidentally in wooden pallets. So accidental introductions are also quite common. The illegal trade in wildlife is quickly becoming another important source of invasive species as people smuggle pets around the world. The last reason, though, is biological control, which fundamentally seems like a silly idea, although it has actually worked. But it's the idea where you introduce a predator of the invading species in the hopes that it will consume the pest. And like I said, it does work really well sometimes. However, it has also failed spectacularly and simply made the problem much, much worse when that new species targets other native species as well. So keep a North American example. A parasitic species of fly was introduced to control gypsy moths, which were themselves invasive species, but it turned out that this parasitic fly also parasitized over 200 of the native species of moths. So that became a huge problem. So we've introduced non-native species, invasive species, numerous times for a wide variety of reasons. Once a species is introduced, there are a couple factors that influence how likely that species will become invasive. First, disturbance. A disturbed ecosystem likely has less competitive pressure between species, and an invader is more likely to become established. Second, if available nutrients are artificially increased, there's less competition in the system, and an invader can establish. Third, the natural diversity of a system being invaded. Systems with low biodiversity often have unsaturated niches that can be exploited by an invader. The last factor is called natural enemy release, and this is the hypothesis wherein the absence of natural predators and pathogens of a population can release a population to grow essentially exponentially. There is some scientific evidence to support this idea, where Mitchell and Power in 2003 compared the fungal and pathogen load of invasive plant species in North America to those in their native ranges, and they found a substantial decrease of these pathogens in the invading population. So when you put all of these things together, the likelihood of invasion is pretty high. and islands, as well as aquatic systems, often have one or more of these characteristics, which makes them more vulnerable to invasion. In addition, island habitats are often isolated with endemic species that often lack adaptations to deal with invading species. For example, many island birds have lost the ability to fly, and they simply build their nests on the ground, and this makes their eggs and their offspring more vulnerable to invading rats. So island species often also lack resistance to disease that the invaders might bring. And all of that makes islands in particular pretty vulnerable to invasive species. In Guam, the brown tree snake eats eggs, nestlings, and adult birds, and the invasive species at this point has driven 10 of the 13 forest bird species to extinction. So invasive species are a pretty serious problem. Invasive species have actually driven other species to extinction, and this seems to happen more often than not on islands. I wanted to start this slide just by making the point that invasive species is not a small problem. In the United States alone, there are 20 species of invasive mammal, 97 exotic birds, 128 species of exotic fish, 88 species of exotic mollusk, 5,000 species of exotic plants, 53 exotic reptiles and amphibians, and 4,500 exotic insects. When you add that all up, it's almost 10,000 species. So this is not a small problem. And what's really quite scary about this is that the solution to get rid of one of those species probably won't work for almost all of the others. So what are the consequences of invasion? What will an invasive species do? First, the first one is called biotic homogenization. As introductions continue, biologically distinct communities start to look more and more alike, similar to one another. A few highly competitive species will take over, and local biodiversity will decline. Invasive species not only make other species go extinct, they are destroying entire communities, transforming them all basically into the same thing. As a relatively few species take over large areas, not only are communities disappearing, but genetic diversity is also declining, potentially impairing speciation. Invasive species have also been observed to disturb ecosystem processes and patterns. And this fundamentally changes nutrient dynamics and other basic ecosystem processes. This has led to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to identify invasive species as the leading threat to the delivery of ecosystem services. That's quite a statement. As an example, consider cheatgrass. It was introduced to North America in the 1860s from the Mediterranean. This grass has come to dominate the intermountain west of the United States and Canada. The grass burns more frequently and more intensely than native grasses, and the consequence of that is that it's been able to outcompete native shrubs, native grasses, and native trees as more frequent fire eliminates those other species. This essentially has changed the ecosystem so fundamentally that it may be impossible to restore it. Of course, the worst impact of invasive species is the extinction of local taxa. So currently, 42% of the endangered species in the US are threatened by invasive species. Over half, so the 91 species of all the recent extinctions worldwide, about 170 species, have been attributed either in whole or in part to invasive species. Lastly, I want to address economic consequences. Many invasive species have had major economic benefits. Most of the world's crops, like wheat, lettuce, and watermelon, uh, as well as pollinators like the European honeybee, and economically valuable fish like brown trout, have been intentionally introduced successfully and seen large economic benefits for the people who did this. However, there are lots of examples where introduced species have had negative economic consequences. The zebra mussel is a well-studied example of how invasive species can also have serious economic costs. The mussel, which was introduced via ballast water, grows in dense clusters that foul boats and clog pipes. Clearing the pipes for power plants and water treatment facilities cost an estimated $100 million a year in the United States. David Pimentel of Cornell University wanted to get an estimate of like the global cost of invasive species for the United States. So looking at all the invasive species and all of the impaired ecosystem services, as well as all of the like direct costs. And his assessment is maybe one of the most thorough. He estimates that it costs the United States about $120 billion a year to deal with invasive species. And most of those costs were largely because of controlling the invaders or direct economic damage. Given how serious the consequences of invasive species are, uh, we should take some time to discuss what we can do about them. There are numerous case studies that have proven that once an introduced species has established itself and begun to spread, eradication or control is very hard and very expensive. So prevention really should be our first priority. Therefore, monitoring for introduced species can more than pay for itself. If a species makes it into a new habitat, then eradication efforts really need to be quick. Even still, some species will resist eradication and long-term control will be required. Let's explore what prevention means in a little more depth. Policy that reduce propagular pressure will likely reduce the number of species that establish themselves. We've observed enough invasions now that we can identify common routes by which different species are introduced to novel habitats. For example, marine invaders are typically transported in ship ballast water, so policies that have ballast water changed offshore can limit invasions to coastal waters. Many terrestrial species are transported in packaging material and shipping containers, so inspections at ports of entry can detect and eliminate potential invaders. Certain industries are responsible for a disproportionate number of invasions, like the pet trade, so working with these industries, creating policies that regulate these industries, should help us find ways to limit invasions. Assessing the invasiveness of a species before it's imported to a country can also be a really important part of prevention. A great example of this is taken from Australia, where the Australian Weed Risk Assessment is a screening tool that asks 49 questions about a plant species before it's considered for import. The questions focus on traits that make the plants more likely to be invasive, and high-scoring plants are prohibited. It was argued, though, that this assessment was too strict and it was excluding lots of species that might be economically beneficial to Australia. So to test this claim, scientists assessed non-native species that were already imported into Australia using these criteria. Some of them were invasive, others were harmless garden plants. And the results really affirmed the validity of the assessment. 100% of the invasive species were rejected, which is great, and only 7% of the harmless plants would have been excluded. And while it's not great that the test got those wrong, I think wrongly rejecting 7% seems like a pretty acceptable cost to prevent invasions. If a species makes it into the country and establishes a self-sustaining population, eradication is your next choice. And it can work, but the key seems to be quick response. Eradication can be costly, but the earlier in an invasion it's done, the more likely it will be to be successful. Eradication programs on islands have also been more successful than on the mainland, though there are examples of mainland eradications that work. Invertebrate pests are a lot harder to get rid of, it seems, but larger vertebrates can fairly easily be eliminated. Success stories include the eradication of goats, rats, and pigs from islands, and the African land snail from Florida. Some invertebrates that have been eliminated from islands include the tsetse fly and screwworm fly. Eradication has also failed pretty spectacularly, and the best example of this is taken from the United States when they spent $200 million in the 1950s trying to get rid of the fire ant. Lastly, controlling the invasive species once it's established is also possible and often necessary. This is the most expensive option as it requires the extensive use of chemicals typically or some kind of biocontrol. It also has sometimes required large-scale habitat modification and really expensive manual removal programs. I guess to just finish up here with this slide, dealing with invasive species is not easy. It requires vigilance and it will come at a cost. But the risks are great for species and critical ecological services. There are several invasive species that are particularly difficult to deal with because, well, we really, really like them. And by that I mean things like cats and dogs. I'm just going to focus on cats because this video is already running a little long. Cats have decimated breeding populations of seabirds throughout the world, and they've also been implicated in the extinction of at least 33 different bird species. That's a pretty big impact. Domestic cats are the #1 direct killer of birds in North America, and in the United States alone they kill about 2.4 billion birds every year. That's also a pretty big impact. Cats are also an important vector for the parasite toxoplasmosis, and that's not only dangerous for things like monk seals and otters, it's also really dangerous for pregnant women, and it's been linked with some pretty crazy diseases like Alzheimer's, autism, schizophrenia, and blindness in humans. This idea is made even more terrifying when you consider that 74% of cats have toxoplasmosis, and they're basically lacing our environment with it in their feces. Peter Mara is a research scientist at the Smithsonian who's done a lot of research on the impacts of cats for bird populations, and when he brought this issue to the public consciousness and had the audacity of suggesting that we control cat populations, in particular feral cat populations, with a limited extermination program, he was roundly vilified, to the point where people were calling for his job, and he was receiving death threats. That's how much people love their cats. Not even their cats, that cute, cuddly, wild or feral cats. There's basically at this point zero political will to control cat populations, and so this invasive species will remain uncontrolled, and will continue to pose a huge threat for birds in particular, but also people. And I think that's a good segue to sort of get into talking about disease a little bit. I'm going to squeeze disease into this video, though it really deserves its own. I'm including disease in this video because by moving diseases around, much as we've moved species around, we can basically have much the same effect as invasive species, as in we harm biodiversity. I'm going to start with a general overview of how disease can contribute to declining populations and even extinctions. I'll then go through 2 or 3 examples. First, we have seen disease cause extinctions in the wild. The black-footed ferret, its last wild population was eliminated by canine distemper. So disease is totally capable of causing extinctions. Also, disease can spread pretty rapidly in migratory populations, as we've seen with white nose syndrome in bats. Habitat loss and degraded habitat quality can really exacerbate an introduced disease. Basically, it will increase the density of remaining individuals in a smaller area. It can cause stress and increase exposure to foreign pathogens that increase the susceptibility and mortality rate of the disease. So habitat loss and degradation is a really important part of this story. And then finally, pollution, stress caused by climate change, and the presence of novel parasites can weaken immune systems and thereby increase susceptibility to disease. Neonicotinoids and a parasitic mite have caused significant mortality in honeybees, as an example. There are many really notable examples where disease has caused significant population declines, including the North American chestnut blight, the chytrid fungus that caused golden toad to go extinct, white nose syndrome, which has caused a 90% decline in the little brown bat population, and snake fungal disease, which killed half of the mesocycle rattlesnakes in the United States last year. So I think that pretty much sums up invasive species for now. There are obviously many examples I didn't use here. Don't worry, we'll come back to the importance of invasive species and disease later in the course. But for now, let's move on to climate change, the last of our major threats to biodiversity.